This is part two, more nitty-gritty. Deploys to Australia. In the early 1950s, Rees sent two of his psychiatric shock troops to Australia, Dr. Eric Cunningham Dax and Dr. Fred E. Emery. Dax had written a chapter for Rees's 1949 book, Modern Practice in Psychological Medicine, and had trained at the same hospital where Rees had practiced. Dax was also a protege of Sargent. Sargent had initiated a brainwashing technique called deep sleep, in which patients were given massive doses of drugs to keep them asleep 20 hours or more a day, which increased their susceptibility to quote-unquote programming. Under Sargent's tutelage, Dax performed 1,300 experiments in deep sleep and rapidly became one of Britain's top practitioners of the so-called physical methods of psychiatry, which included prefrontal lobotomies, on which Dax wrote a monograph, and electric shock, which was often administered during deep sleep. The acknowledged problem with deep sleep was that up to 2% of the patients subjected to it died. Those who lived were often psychologically destroyed. Arriving in Australia in 1952, Dax set up the Mental Hygiene Department of Victoria, which in turn set up Australia's entire mental health care system. As Rees said in his introduction to the book he told Dax to write, Asylum to Community, the development of the mental hygiene service in Victoria, Australia, quote, the mental hygiene service of Victoria may indeed have provided a major training ground in psychiatry and mental health work for all the English-speaking populations of the southwestern Pacific region. This is a matter of very great importance, unquote. The second Tavistock brainwasher whom Rees dispatched to Melbourne around the same time and whose work would help shape Dax's own, Dr. Fred Emery, set up shop as senior research officer in the Department of Audiovisual Aids at Melbourne University. There, Emery began conducting experiments on school children, as described in his article, Psychological Effects of the Western Film, to see how Oedipal patterns could be induced in school children. Oh my God. A subject of some relevance to 28-year-old Martin Bryant and the mysterious deaths of both his father and Martin's own elderly girlfriend. So, of course, it's not with an eye toward treating any condition. It's with an eye toward systematically exploiting weaknesses that would have been associated with these complexes in order to create weapons, assets. By the early 1960s, Emery, together with the chairman of Tavistock's governing council, Dr. Eric Trist, was giving lectures to select audiences at Tavistock on methods to brainwash entire societies. In this new age of mass communication, they said, a series of short universal shocks would destabilize a targeted population, plunging it into a form of shell shock, a mass neurosis. Keeping in mind that all of this really comes from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, which had begun its researches by, I believe, I'm not sure, but I think they were genuinely trying to help sufferers, veterans who were suffering from shell shock after World War I. The awful utility of it, I think, was I don't know, I'm shooting in the dark, but it seems like that was the exclusive interest of the British in this research. Didn't have to do with helping anybody. Had to do with understanding the so-called levers of the mind that they could manipulate to produce effects in individuals and whole societies. And you look at the United States, it really looks terribly clear now that what you see in the cities is a result of mass neurosis, mass psychosis, future shocks, the so-called counterculture. All of this a lot of this was covered in the last installment going on here. If the shocks were repeated over a period of years, a more and more infantile pattern of thinking would develop. Emery elaborated these concepts in his 1967 article in Tavistock's magazine Human Relations, entitled "The Next 30 Years, Concepts, Methods, and Anticipations," and in his 1975 book Futures We Are In. In the latter, he outlined the 3 stages of this process. Quote, 1. People would lose their moral judgment. 2, next, segmentation, societal disintegration would begin, in which the individual's focus moves from the nation-state to preoccupation with local community or family. And finally, 3, dissociation would set in, a world in which fantasy and reality are indistinguishable, in which the individual becomes a societal unit. Emery calls this final result Clockwork Orange, after the Anthony Burgess novel, in which habitual random violence by gangs of youth is the order of the day, while adults retreat to their television sets and other forms of virtual reality. In 1980, Trist looked back at the last 2 decades of the assassination of the Kennedys, of Martin Luther King, the Vietnam War, the oil shocks, the Iranian hostage crisis, etc., and announced that the process Tavistock had predicted and had indeed begun would now accelerate. Meanwhile, in Australia, Dax brought Sargent to Melbourne on the 14th of August 1962 to lecture on, quote, the mechanism of brainwashing and conversion. Another of Sargent's proteges, the Sydney-based psychiatrist Dr. Harry Bailey, was a fanatical practitioner of deep sleep and killed a number of patients during the experiments at the Chelmsford Private Hospital in the 1960s and 70s. The resulting scandal led to the convening of an investigatory royal commission into deep sleep and to Bailey's own suicide in 1985. As reported in the book Deep Sleep by Brian Baumberger and Janet Fife-Yeomans, which chronicled Bailey's experiments, Bailey and Sargent, quote, remained in constant contact for almost 30 years, and Bailey often spoke of the competition between them to see who could keep their patients in the deepest coma without killing them. Wow. So it's all being run by psychopaths. Because psychopaths have great utility for the empire. They're willing to do anything. They don't have any scruples. They even derive some pleasure from it. And they have chummy little competitions. Dax himself pushed ahead with research on turbulence, aggression, and brainwashing, all from the Reesian perspective of using psychiatry to shape society as a whole, as exemplified by a speech he gave at the University of Melbourne on the 20th of July 1964, titled Some Observations on Psychiatric Research. It is no more than a few years past, he said, when psychiatry was solely represented by the mental hospitals before the child guidance clinics were first begun, where the psychiatrists started to move into the outpatient diagnostic centers. The mental hospitals may be likened to the grandmothers of community psychiatry. Within the span of a single generation, psychiatrists have been thrown from the protective, circumscribed, and alienating walls of these hospitals into a restless, changing, and aggressive community, seething with turbulence which struggles to adjust to the gathering speed of mechanization and the disrupting forces of a disordered society. So they disorder this society, then they rush out to see if by studying it they might expedite the process and enhance the effects of the destabilization through a kind of bizarre community-based feedback loop going on. Most of us are more experienced in the treatment of individuals than in correcting the pathological behavior of groups, though there may be an increasing tendency to seek our advice in these and related matters. For instance, the frightening implications of forcible indoctrination of individuals on the one level and communities on the other are closely related to our specialty. Yet almost paradoxically, we are driven to consider as to whether modifications of such methods of indoctrination can be used in the treatment of some of the psychoses. Foreshadowing his work on Martin Bryant, Dax continued, "In many of these fields, the consideration of aggression is of the greatest importance. This is, of course, no accident. There is no more useful subject for research studies at the present time." This is all italicized. There is no more useful subject for research studies at the present time, whether it be in the individual or the group. Here, from the individual, the psychiatrist has much to learn. It may be that the aggression is turned inwards, ultimately resulting in suicide, outwards in homicide, or more specifically in hostility toward the community, in causing death on the road. Going on. Moreover, many a murderer has the inability to postpone his strong emotional reactivity to thwarting, and this often has an association with the past history of repeated frustration of a variety of which he has been unable to deal. Or again, the person who uses a motor car as an extension of his own aggressive body image may be using it in escaping from his anxieties and supposed rejection by the community. Yet it seems that none of these aggressive manifestations would be of the same magnitude were it not for the effect of alcohol. It releases these strains by depressing the inadequate control which spreads its thin veneer over the underlying aggression. Precisely these elements were to arise in the Martin Bryant case. In 1969, Dax left his prestigious, highly influential position in Melbourne to go to the backwater state of Tasmania, an island of some 300,000 people off Australia's southeast coast. A prominent U.S. psychiatrist who specializes in ritual abuse and who is ultimately familiar with Australian psychiatry over the past 3 decades, when queried by this news service as to why in the world Dax would move to Tasmania, replied, "Tasmania is the Appalachia of Australia. There's a lot of alcoholism, a lot of incest. It is the poorest of all the states, very primitive, with a lot of descendants from very violent criminals from the British days. You will find many people there with no value system, no superego. It is the perfect place for Manchurian candidates and for all sorts of experiments. He could do there whatever he liked." So this is from, again, this quote is from a prominent U.S. psychiatrist. But let's see if he's named. Maybe. So Tasmania is sought out because it represents a pool of potential assets, disposable assets. Something of great interest must have been taking place in Tasmania because two of Tavistock's leading international operatives, the Melbourne-based Dr. Alan Stoller, a past president of the World Federation of Mental Health, and a close association of John Rawlings Rees and of Dax, and Dr. John Bowlby, went to Tasmania for extended visits in 1971 and 1972, respectively. So that kind of clinches it for me. Dax and Bryant. From early childhood, Martin Bryant was a very disturbed individual, as British psychiatrist Paul Mullen could not help but record in his evaluation for the defense. Mr. Bryant was assessed on a number of occasions by psychologists and psychiatrists. He was noted to be aggressive, destructive, and very difficult with other children. There are references to him stealing, to him having violent outbursts, and to tormenting vulnerable children. There are records of Mr. Bryant torturing and harassing animals and of tormenting his sister. Bryant was notorious among his schoolmates for carrying a green can of gasoline, which he constantly threatened to pour on things and set them alight, as he once did so on himself. His schoolmates would frequently remark, "Here comes silly Martin with his can." Before long, this behavior brought him to the attention of Dax, as Mullen noticed. The talent scout, Dax. Quote, in February 1984, Mr. Bryant was assessed by a very experienced clinical psychiatrist, Dr. Cunningham Dax, an evaluation which set the parameters for all further treatment of Bryant. Contacted by an American academic on the 16th of April 1997 about his evaluation of Bryant, Dax said, "I left Tasmania in 1983, I think. And I had seen him a few times before that, but I had no notes on him except that I thought that he was below normal intellectually and that his father was very permissive about him. And I wondered about the boy, whether later he might have some schizophrenic features, but that is as far as I went." Unquote. Judging by the impact Bryant made on another psychiatrist to examine Bryant soon after, Dax was singularly unobservant. And we know why. Unobservant, of course, of the things that a normal psychologist would be alert to. Dr. Ian Sale, psychiatrist for the prosecution, recalled in a discussion on the 16th of April, quote, when he was about 16 or 17, he was examined by a government doctor for the purpose of a pension assessment. It was to that doctor that he made some reference to having a wish to shoot people. She still remembers that to this day. Dr. Sale noted that not only did Dax have no recall of the assessment, but that, quote, unfortunately, the clinical notes that were made were destroyed. Ostensibly because Dax, quote, was practicing in the rooms of another psychiatrist. So, of course, that's a good reason to destroy the records, right? When that psychiatrist died, it was the provision of his will that the notes be destroyed, apparently, which is remarkable. And not only were his notes destroyed, but also Dr. Cunningham Dax's notes were destroyed. Wow. The psychiatrist Dr. T.H.G. Dick was also British and had served as Tasmania's medical commissioner beginning in 1969, the year Dax moved to Tasmania. Shortly after, Dax joined Dick on the medical advisory committee to Tasmania's Mental Health Commission. Despite Dax's fascination with aggression, suicide, and murder, Dax claimed that he knew very little about Bryant, and when asked to comment on the relevance of his associate Emery's theory of turbulence for the Port Arthur events, Dax replied guardedly, quote, I don't think I can answer your question usefully, unquote. Emery himself died in early April 1997, and thus could not answer the question either. But, Dax said, quote, the person who knows a good deal more about Bryant is in the University of Tasmania, in the hospital there, the Royal Hobart. they did a good deal of study of Bryant at the time. Professor Jones is his name, but the person who knew more about him was the research person who was particularly interested in Bryant, unquote. Dr. Jones was British and who, until his retirement, headed the floors of the Royal Hobart Hospital, which are devoted to psychiatric studies, was unavailable for comment. What the police knew. As well known as Bryant was to Tasmania's Tavistock network, he was equally well known to the police, despite post-Port Arthur protestations to the contrary, as evidenced in the following. 1. He had repeatedly threatened to kill some of his neighbors in Tasmania, several of which incidents at least had been reported to the police. 2. On one of his frequent international flights, he'd been arrested in Melbourne airport on suspicion of being a drug courier, in part because he traveled without luggage. He was taken to the Royal Melbourne Hospital and examined before being released. On another occasion, pornographic videos depicting bestiality were found in his luggage. According to one police source interviewed by this news service, Bryant's police records indicated a profile of a psychotic multiple killer. 3. That profile accorded well with what his neighbors thought of him, and not merely because of his frequent threats. There was intense suspicion among them that Bryant had murdered first his spinster friend and protector, wealthy heiress Helen Harvey, and then, 10 months later, his father, Morris Bryant. Eyewitnesses had seen Bryant wrench the steering wheel from Eyewitnesses had seen Bryant wrench the steering wheel from Harvey while the two were out driving, and Harvey had told the mayor of Tasman Council not long before the fatal car crash that killed her and seriously wounded Bryant, "Oh, he's a worry to me sometimes. He grabbed hold of the steering wheel coming down today and nearly pulled me off the road, going silly. What would you do with him?" On August 16, 1993, Morris Bryant was found wearing weight belts dead at the bottom of a dam on the property formerly owned by Harvey, which she had willed to Martin Bryant. Bryant had had numerous arguments with his father, who moved onto the property the same night that Harvey was killed. His son was particularly bitter that his father was getting rid of the menagerie that the younger Bryant and Harvey had collected. After his father had disappeared, but before his body had been found, Martin ran into neighbor Marion Larner outside the local hospital. As Larner reported to the police shortly thereafter, who never questioned her further, as Larner reported to the police shortly thereafter, I think I have so many thoughts racing around as I'm reading. I'm like misreading because I've just is like a tsunami of thoughts that are triggered almost with every line. The implications of this, and the way entire societies trying to jump back and forth between the realm of the microcosm of the individual to societies as a whole. Particularly, my mind's bouncing back and forth. As Larner reported to the police shortly thereafter, who never questioned her further, Bryant had accosted her excitedly, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Oh, Marion, it's so exciting, so exciting!" She asked. "What are you talking about, Martin?" Dad's at the bottom of the dam," he replied. "You'll hear all about it soon. You'll read all about it." And when the elder Bryant's body was soon after pulled from the dam, quote, "the searchers were amazed to see Martin walking back from the dam laughing." According to a book about Bryant, Suddenly One Sunday, by local journalist Mike Bingham. Several days before, another neighbor, John Featherstone, had run into strangers inquiring about a boat which a man named Martin had advertised for sale. When asked why he was selling the boat, Martin Bryant had told them that his father had just recently passed away. After recounting the incident to his wife, Featherstone told her incredulously, "I saw Morris just this morning." 4. But it was not only local police who noticed Bryant. In early 1994, on one of his trips to the United Kingdom, he checked into a hotel at Hereford, the super-sensitive home of Britain's elite Special Air Services, SAS. Bryant started acting so strangely that the hotel management notified the police, who notified Interpol, which in turn put in inquiries to the police in Tasmania, who reported that his slate was clean. Next section. The guy had military training. Beyond all these and other run-ins with the police, which curiously never resulted in anything, still another anomaly is the obvious planning and skill which went into the commission of the mass murder itself, well beyond the capabilities of someone diagnosed as borderline intellectually disabled in the lowest 1 to 2% of Australia's population and unable to manage his own affairs. After reading Mullen's psychiatric evaluation, one of Australia's senior counter-terror experts who had himself investigated the case observed to this news service on the subject of Bryant, ostensibly having learned all he knew about weaponry and tactics from survival magazines, quote, "If this guy had weapons and survival skills from magazines, then that conflicts with his learning difficulties. How could he understand the books in the first place? Any decent lawyer would have a field day with this report. They would pick it to pieces. For a start, Bryant worked out the military aspects of the shooting. Most soldiers couldn't do that on their own, but Bryant did. What's more, he outsmarted the police by doubling back to the seascape. That's not a low IQ. Then, look at the planning of the assault, the equipment required, the weapons stash, the most effective weapons to use, how much ammunition to take with him, how to use the weaponry, planning an escape route, creating havoc in multiple areas to keep the authorities guessing, and so on. Now, how could he have learned all that from books with such a low IQ and poor reading skills? The guy had military training. Tasmanian Deputy Commissioner Lupo Prince, who directed the overall police operation in Port Arthur on April 28, 1996, observed dryly to the New Citizen in mid-April 1997 that Bryant had, quote, set up 6 different areas of activity. He had police running in circles. That's pretty good for a guy who's a slow learner. Prince also had told the Courier Mail on the 28th of April 1997 that he believes Bryant, quote, was playing out of some prearranged script. What the script was, we don't know. Because, unquote, because even though Bryant, unlike most mass murderers, did not commit suicide and was not killed, and thus, quote, is able to tell his story, he hasn't. It's really frustrating, unquote. That Bryant's actions and even his very words had been choreographed was also the assessment of the man who dealt most closely with him, Sergeant Terry McCarthy, the police negotiator during the siege at Seascape. McCarthy recalled with some amazement how very calm Bryant, who was then calling himself Jamie, was throughout the siege. Author Mike Bingham interviewed McCarthy and summarized his observations in his book. McCarthy had, quote, found that parts of Bryant's conversation seemed prepared in advance, and had become clear to some of what Bryant had done, that some of what Bryant had done was extremely well planned, unquote. And, as Bingham further recorded in the observations of Broad Arrow Kitchen supervisor Bridget Cook about Bryant, quote, the care that he took of himself struck her. He appeared to be having a fine time, very, very exciting time, but he made sure there was no way he could be snuck up on. And where did the well-trained Bryant get his military-style weapons? In an interview with the Herald Sun on June 23, 1996, Victorian farmer and gun collector Bill Drysdale said that he had turned his Colt AR-15 in to the Victorian police in February 1993. But he was virtually certain that the AR-15 Bryant used was his. both because of the rarity of that weapon in Australia at the time and because of the unique mark a gunsmith had made on the barrel of his rifle, which matched that on Bryant's rifle. The serial numbers were almost identical. And, quote, my rifle also had a collapsible stock and a Colt sight, just as the massacre weapon has, said Drysdale. The Herald Sun noted, quote, one of Australia's largest firearms importers told the Sunday Herald Sun that firearms matching the Port Arthur weapon were scarce as hen's teeth, and that the chances of two weapons of the same type, with almost matching serial numbers, being imported into Australia were next to nothing. After an interview with police, Drysdale was ordered by them not to talk to reporters any further. Why did the Tasmanian police repeatedly overlook Bryant's activities? The chief of police official for Tasmania until his recent retirement was Commissioner of Police John Johnson, who was also the head of the Australian Bureau of Criminal Intelligence. Johnson commanded the police team which carried out a 15-week investigation of the Port Arthur events and somehow managed to miss all of the anomalies recorded above. Who is Johnson? Among other things, he's the first prominent Australian police official to call for the legalization of drugs, which he did in 1995. As a series of articles in the New Citizen in 1996 demonstrated, those pushing the decriminalization of drugs in Australia, whose major funder is George Soros, are precisely those London-linked financial circles who are already benefiting from drug money laundering. Right after the Port Arthur investigation, Johnson retired and has seemingly disappeared. Said a police source to the New Citizen, "You can't find him because he doesn't intend to be found." There are still other anomalies in the case beyond Bryant's contact with psychiatric networks and with the police. Despite official pledges to, quote, get to the bottom of the case so such a tragedy would never happen again, all evidence about the case, including the psychiatric evaluations of Bryant, was ordered sealed by the judge. In addition, an expose, which had been produced by the TV show Four Corners on the Tasmanian Mental Health Department, which had extensive contact with Bryant from the time he was a child, was suddenly cancelled just before it was to air. Then, several weeks after the Port Arthur massacre, 23-year-old Dion Gary Yost went on a shooting rampage in the Northern Territory town of Palmerston, in which he wounded one civilian and 4 police officers. Yost had attended, several years after Bryant had, the same Tasmanian high school. According to psychiatrists, Bryant modeled his murders, at least in part, on that of Thomas Hamilton's March 13, 1996 slaughter in Dunblane, Scotland, an act that horrified the world. Bryant's neighbors even said that he was in the UK on one of his many trips there when Dunblane took place. There, too, the lone nut Hamilton, a pedophile well known to police, had nonetheless been allowed to organize scouting clubs all over Scotland. And then next we'll get into the Monarch Project, which probably rings enormous bells in everybody's heads, or it should, at least people who visit this little channel. So I will be out, get into that next time, soon. It's just, let me just read a little, the Tavistock sponsored form of blind terror, which is contrived and it reminds me of what's the word I'm looking for? It's cultivated. It's not blind terror, it's cultivated terror, of which Bryant, as an example, has the advantage to its authors that its programmed zombies almost invariably kill themselves or are killed during the course of events, leaving little or no evidence. So we'll get into that Monarch programming, the Monarch Project, next time. Thank you, everyone.